Listen, it's always funny when somebody else gets scared, right? It's when it's you that the whole game changes. I've got a 9-year-old who loves to scare people right now, and she will like try to sneak up, and she's not very sneaky. Like, don't tell her this. Like, she'll try to sneak up, but she sneaks up like this. Ah! And it's not so scary. But one day I decided I was going to get her back. This was about a year ago. And we have this like barn door between the front half of our house and the back half of our house. And she came in from school, and I hid on the other side so that when she opened the door, I was going to get her. And so she opened the door, and I jumped, and she went, "Ha!" And then like fell backwards, just straight backwards, face turned white. She didn't move. And I thought, oh no, this is when CPS gets involved. And like I had that moment, like, oh, what did I do? Do I need to take her to the hospital? What's going on? This is not a good moment. This does not look good for Dad. And then all of a sudden, from that little stupor she was in, I just hear, and she starts giggling. And I'm like, okay, we're safe. It's fine. Mom doesn't have to know this happened. It's all good. But since then, we've gone back and forth and trying to scare each other, and I'm way better at it than she is. Let me just tell you that. But yesterday, I'm sitting drinking my coffee around our kitchen island, and she comes downstairs, and she was watching YouTube on a phone, and by that, I mean like it was right here, and she did not see the world around her. And all of a sudden, she looked up, and I'm just there sipping coffee, doing nothing. And I'm pretty sure that was what did her in. Like, just, she just did that, dropped the phone. It was one of those moments. It was so good, so good. I didn't even try. Maybe my problem is I'm trying too hard. But it's so good. We are in a series talking about uncommon courage and what it looks like to have courage in the middle of those frightening hard times, in the moments when fear creeps in. How do we stay strong and courageous? And there's a reading plan that goes with it. Last week, these bookmarks weren't in quite on time, but there's a reading plan that goes with this. You'll get this on the way out. It's one chapter per day through the book of Joshua, and we're going to walk through that book together. If you are up to speed with us, you've gone through 5 chapters already. Today we're going to dig into chapter 6 together. If you're not up to speed, it's okay. It's a quick read to get caught up and to jump right in with us and to keep going from here. But we had so many good things come from this last week. We had several small groups. One of them talked to me that said that it was the best conversation they've had in a long time. Just going verse by verse through the first chapter of Joshua and asking really good questions and digging in. Some other cool things, like we had baptisms last week. Let's celebrate that again, okay? Always good to celebrate that life change. And we had one elementary student who wore her baptism shirt to school this week with the phrase, and I quote, "People need Jesus." And I love that. Like, we have elementary kids who are leading the way in courage in sharing their faith with this world. Is that not amazing to see these kids just go out on fire, ready to share the hope of Jesus with the world? It's so good. In the series where we started last week, Joshua was equipped. He was commissioned into leadership by God. Moses had died, and Joshua is now leading the Israelite people. And so he is leading the way forward. And then today where we're going to go is now we see battles start to happen. God has told them the promised land is yours, but you've got to go take it. And so those battles start today, the battles with the Canaanites, and it all starts with this verse from Joshua 1:9. "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." This challenge right from the get-go. Joshua, you're stepping into a huge moment in your life and in the life of all of these Israelites. You're about to take this promised land, so be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Do not be discouraged. God is with you. The challenge has been issued, and now the journey and the battles begin. And so this helps paint a picture of where we're headed. Okay, green line is where they are, where they've been, and now we've crossed over and we're heading toward Jericho. This is a huge place, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, why that's so important. But as we head into this battle right here, that battle territory, it's going to make you ask some questions as you read it, and I want to talk about some of those questions together. There is a serious moral and ethical question that comes into play where we're like, okay, battles and fighting, and there's death, and there's more fighting and people dying. What do we do with all of that? Because we see that in the Old Testament, that there's battles and there are all of this violence that happens, and we have to ask the question, war, what is it good for? There it is. There it is. I knew it would happen somewhere. You just got to wait for it. It's so good. So good. There are a lot of people who struggle with the idea of war, in particular in the Bible, with the Old Testament. Some people have given up on God, have given up on the church because of how much war they read about in the Bible. And they're like, how can a good God let this happen? How does this happen? And let me paint the context for that, and then you're going to talk about it more in small groups this week. But anytime you see a battle in the Old Testament in particular, anytime you see this fighting, it's a very unique moment in time. Otherwise, the command was peace. We see that right from the beginning. The initial command for all mankind was to live in peace with one another and with all of creation. But there are moments where these battles come up because, let me paint this picture. God does not share his holiness with unholiness. They don't mix. They cannot mix together. God does not share that. And so we see Canaan, which is a land full of violence. It's a land full of difficult people who are making life difficult for the people around them. It was full of injustice. It was full of child sacrifice. It was full of perversion. And God has given them an opportunity for grace and for mercy, but they haven't chosen it. In fact, if you want to go back and look at it, it was all the way back in Genesis 15 that God said, these people are going to turn their hearts from me. And that was 4 generations ago. 4 generations have passed. In their timeline, a generation was about 100 years. So 400 years have passed. These people could have turned toward God, and there would not be an issue. But instead, they stuck in their ways or even went even further with their walk away from God. And because of that, we have this moment where there is now justice, where there is a battle to be fought. And I also want you to know this, as we read about battles in Joshua, it almost looks like it's painting a picture of genocide, like an entire people group is getting wiped out. But understand as you're reading it in this chapter 6 through chapter 16-ish, as you're reading through all of these battles, there's a lot of hyperbole used, where it says that all of the people were wiped out. But then, like in chapter 10, it says everyone was wiped out. But in chapter 15, they go back to that town and there's people living there. Well, how is that possible if everyone was wiped out? It's because it was speaking in exaggerated terms. That just means they've taken over this land. They have won the battle for control. And so we see that all over in this place. When you see these moments of justice, when you see moments of mercy, it is a picture that should tell you and does reveal that God hasn't changed. God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament. Yes, there was more battle and there was hard-fought battle in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, we see more of the same. In fact, that exact same place where they crossed the Jordan River to take over Jericho, that we're going to read today, is the exact same place where Jesus met John the Baptist and was baptized. And a whole new progression started, where Jesus now fought evil, and Jesus fought death, and he took it all the way and defeated the enemy, and he defeated death and gave victory to anyone who would believe in him. And so we see that happen. We see that epic battle happen between good and evil in the person of Jesus. And then Jesus goes away and he says, I will come back and I will judge the living and the dead. And so we see this final day of judgment even happening. And so there is still justice, there is still mercy all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. It just looks a little bit different. But it's the same God through all of it. Today, as we go through the Battle of Jericho, it's a familiar story for many of you. Maybe you grew up knowing the story in church, or you've just heard a song in particular about Joshua fighting a battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. We won't sing it quite yet, okay? But that's where he's headed. But Joshua has not yet taken hold of this land that God has promised, this promised land. And his story starts in the same place that our story starts every single time. The journey around starts with a first step. And that first step, if you've taken a first step toward anything in your life, it takes a lot of courage to take that first step into something you don't know, into something we don't know what's going to happen. But God's leading, and so he has the courage to do this. So if you got your Bibles with you, we're going to be in Joshua chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It's the 6th book, 6th chapter, first verse. We can't do 6, 6, and 6. That would be terrible. We're going to do 6, 6, and 1. You can follow along in your Bible. Take notes as you will. But here we go. Joshua 6, verse 1. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one went in. And then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. Now, right off the bat in this story, if you were around last week, you'll remember this. The key to understanding Joshua is not in Joshua's strength and abilities. It is in God's power and God's promises. And we see that right here at the very beginning, a reminder that God is the one who has the power. Because right at the beginning, we see that it's barred because of the Israelites. So all of the people of Canaan, all these people in Jericho were already scared. They knew the power that God had. They knew all about it. And so we see God's power by the way that they were scared, but we also see it right here. I don't know if you caught this. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands." He is speaking in past tense, in present time. Only God can do that. To say, I've already given it to you. They don't have it yet. Joshua still hasn't done anything yet. The army hasn't done anything yet. But God, full of power, shows up on full display right here at the beginning to say, I've already got you. The battle is yours. God's power already seen. Now it goes on to say, here's what you should do. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry the trumpet of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. I love what happens right here because we see right at the beginning, the ark takes center. Enter center stage, the Ark of the Covenant. The ark was the living representation for them of God's presence. Now, as you lead into battle, God's presence leads the way. So you see it right from the beginning. The focus is on what God can do. And then I also love that it's surrounded by trumpet players. So that's cool, right? Any band kids in the room? I mean, you know that trumpet is the instrument of God. And so, well, that's at least, it was my instrument. So that's why I believe that to be true. But it doesn't even say what the trumpets are playing. Like, it could have been like the Ricola kind, or it could have been more like a military trumpet. Maybe it was some ska tunes that they were just shooting out there, some jazz. Who knows? Maybe they were going, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Come on. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. Except that's not even what actually happened. I love that song because it's a great representation for me of stopping to actually read what happens. Because sometimes we come into a text with a familiar thing that we think we already know the story of, but it's not quite right, and we see it a little bit differently the next time. Joshua didn't fight the battle of Jericho and then the walls came tumbling down. We just read it. The walls are coming down first, and then he's going to go in and fight. And so when you pay attention to details, things start to come to life, and you start to see the stories start to make even more sense. You see all over this place, you're going to see the number 7. Anytime you see it, feel free to underline it in your Bible. You're going to see the 7 priests on the 7th day. They give a loud shout, and everything comes in. Like, that number 7 is going to happen 14 times in this story. That matters. The number 7 is the number of God. It's the number of completion. It's used as a symbol all over throughout Scripture. That means, and it should show you that God is in this. God is the one who's leading the way. This is not man's plan. This is God at work. And it shows you that God's timing and God's plans are perfect. If you're going to win this battle, you need God's help, and God's timing and God's plans are perfect. I believe that to be true with every part of my being. But can we all acknowledge for a second, this is the weirdest battle plan ever. Walk around the city. Okay. Got it. We can do that, right? It's just the strangest battle plan. And if you look at that and go like, this doesn't make sense, this is not right, and you have doubts about this story, when you have doubts about your life, if you have doubts about what God is doing, can I tell you something? You're in good company. A lot of people have doubts. And doubts don't disqualify your faith. Doubts give you an opportunity to dig in. And doubts give you an opportunity to go, okay, God, what are you doing? I don't always get it. But I'm going to trust you, and I need to figure out why. But God, help me understand this. If you're in a place where you're doubting God, know that this is a safe place for you to ask those questions. But sometimes those doubts lead us to such an extreme where we give up because we just don't even know anymore. And so we just hit this wall and we give up. And I'm telling you, in those reasons, they're painted throughout this story. Why do we give up? One of them is this. Our perspective is often limited. where we get to a place where we just can't see what's going on and it doesn't make sense. I'm telling you, in this story, you're going to see this unfold. Now, the city of Jericho itself was not a very big town. It was somewhere between 6 to 10 acres, roughly about the size of the plot of land we just bought here in town, 10 acres of land. If you were to go around and walk around the outside of those 10 acres of land, it's not that big. It'll take you less than an hour to walk around. So this is not a super huge challenge that they're about to be tasked with. It's not like they're running a marathon every day for 7 days. They're walking for 7 days. Okay, got it. It's not that big of a thing, and the perspective issue isn't there. The perspective issue is that there's a giant wall that's clouding their vision. They cannot tell what's on the other side of this wall. It's about 40 feet high, and a bunch of scholars have discovered that the way the city was built is that there was a double fortification of walls. So there's an initial wall, and then there's an embankment, and then there's another set of walls separating the inner part of the city from the outer part of the city. And so these guys had no idea what was on the other side of this wall. Joshua had no idea what was on the other side of this wall. All he knew was God said, go walk around it. I can tell you from my life, I can relate a lot of times where I feel like God is calling me in one direction, but all I see is a wall. I get that all the time. I've had that moment even in our building campaign where I felt like, okay, I need to go walk over this land and see if this is really what God has for us. And I walked around it, and I peed on all 4 corners, so I knew it was ours. But as I'm walking, like I could just feel God's presence. But honestly, as I'm walking, the only thing I could see was trees. I don't know how you build on that. I'm not a construction guy. I'm a pastor. And so I see an obstacle, but I knew God was in it. And so we bought it, and this architect has come up with an incredible plan of how we can use this space, and it's going to be fantastic, and God's on the move inside of that. God also put this number in my head. I don't know why God puts numbers and names in my head, but he does, and he's shown it again and again and again, that we need to raise $1.2 million. I don't know how to raise $1.2 million to make this happen, and yet here we are just $300,000 in commitments away from being at that point. Because God is showing up, but so many times I've felt obstacles, and I'm like, I don't know how we make this happen. But okay, God, and we go, and God shows up. At the beginning of the year, I felt like God gave me the number that we need to grow this church community, this family, to 450 people on a Sunday morning. I don't know how to get 450 people here on a Sunday morning, but that's what God has called us to. Actually, I do know. If you invite a friend and bring a friend next week, and they invite a friend and bring a friend, and their friends invite their friends, no, I'm kidding. But honestly, if we all brought somebody with us, we double overnight. Like, that's how growth works. You invite people, and it happens. But all these times, we can hit walls, and we don't know how to make things happen. Maybe in your life, you felt a calling God has put on your life. Or maybe you've been working through a battle with sin. Or maybe you've got a broken relationship with your spouse or with your kid, and you want to heal it, but all you felt is obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and every step you take feels like you're hitting a wall, and you're hitting a wall. You have good intentions, but the wall is really high, and so our temptation is just to quit. That's how it happens for us. But this is why Joshua is such a great hero, because Joshua trusted God's perspective. He believed and he knew that God could see what was on the other side of the wall. And even though he couldn't, he knew God was the one leading. And so he trusted with an uncommon courage, and he started with that first step. Every bit of it starts with the first step. And look what he does as soon as God gives him this command. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." And he ordered the army, "Advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord." I can only imagine, by the way, what the Israelites were thinking when Joshua told them, "All right, here's our battle plan, guys. You ready for this? We're going to do some walking." Okay, then what? Then we're going to do it again. And again, like, it doesn't make sense. But here we are in the story, and look at what they do after Joshua gives them the command. Joshua had spoken this to the people, and then the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. 7 times, again, you're going to see this over and over again. God is in this with horns sounding the whole time. Again, probably ska, okay? But they're playing their song, and the whole world is noticing. There's no way the people inside of the walls don't realize what's going on. Okay, there's horns going. There's people walking all around these walls. We don't know what's going on. We're a little bit afraid. Something's happening. And then look at this. Joshua commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout." So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to camp and spent the night there. And they did this for 6 days. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nothing. For 6 days, they walked around and nothing. Joshua, if you notice this, Joshua just told the army to go. He didn't even tell them the whole plan. God told him, you're going to do this once a day for 6 days, then the seventh day do it 7 times, and then you're going to storm in and do this. Joshua just told them to go. So as far as they know, they're just a part of a really cool marching band. You know, like, here we go, off we go. That's all they know. In fact, maybe like day one at the camp, they're like, dear diary, today's the day that we're going to storm Jericho. And then they get home at night and they're like, just kidding, today was a warm-up lap. Tomorrow we're going to get it. And then day 2, no, still not today, not sure what's going on, but Joshua said, not yet, we have to be quiet. That's weird. Day 3, you just keep going, and nothing happens. Imagine texting your wife going, what'd you do today, honey? Well, we took a lap. Then we came back to camp. Like, what? What's going on here? And we get to a place where it is really easy in those moments when you take a lap and you take a lap and you take a lap and you don't see progress. It is one of those easy moments to give up because our progress isn't always obvious. And we may be doing all of the work, but we're not seeing the fruit quite yet. And all of a sudden, we just start to get to a place where we're tempted to give up. For 6 days, they didn't see progress. My son Liam and I, we'll play Mario Kart together from time to time. At least in Mario Kart, there's a lap indicator in the upper corner that tells you how many more times you have to go around, right? They didn't get that. It wasn't like every time they went around, part of the wall crumbled, and then the next part of the wall crumbled. Like, they got nothing. No visual cues, no lap indicator, no little toad going bloop, bloop over their heads as they were going. Like, nothing cool. We as people, we love progress. We can handle the process as long as we can see progress. We can handle fighting for our marriage as long as we know that there's hope on the other side of the fight. We can handle working to eliminate debt from our lives knowing that there's freedom on the other side. And we see that number go down. We can handle that as long as we see progress. But the question is, will you keep walking even if you don't see progress? Will you keep taking the next step even if it feels like nothing is happening just because you know it's the right thing to keep taking the steps? It can be so frustrating to do things the right way but not see progress. We start doing the laps around whatever we're doing. Maybe there's a battle of purity in your life and you're trying to overcome an addiction. And so you take one step at a time and you try to fight through it, but the temptation is still there even though you've asked God to alleviate that temptation from your life. Or maybe there's depression in your life and you've asked God for hope and you've asked God for healing and for the clouds to be lifted, but you just don't feel it being lifted even though you're giving everything you've got to God and it doesn't seem like anything's happening yet. Or maybe there's tension with your spouse. And every time you take it to God and ask him to bring relief and healing and ask him to help you find a way through it, it feels like nothing. We're back the next day to the exact same issue we're going.